Hello, I'm Sam from Sound on Sound magazine. I'm here at the Superbooth show in Berlin, Germany, and there could be no better way to start this show than talking to the two people I've met here. I'm proud and honoured to be in the company of legendary synth designers Dave Smith and Marcus Ryle. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks so much.
So we're here on the Sequential booth, or just outside the Sequential booth, where it's not quite as noisy. But the product we're actually going to be talking about is not badged Sequential, it's badged Oberheim. And I think probably some people, including myself until very recently, won't realise that, Marcus, your involvement in the audio industry actually began with Oberheim.
Yeah, actually that was Tom. I was very lucky to be living in Los Angeles and met Tom when I was 19 years old. Actually, I might have been still 18 when I met him, and he offered me a job. I was a keyboard player and self-taught engineer, and done a handful of projects. And he thankfully thought he saw something worthwhile in me, and at that time, it hadn't occurred to me that I should actually have a real job. Like many at the time, I was sure I was still going to be a rock star or something. And so from 1980 to 85. That was like the best school in the industry I could have, working with Tom and Jim Cooper and Michel Guadic and a number of engineers there on everything starting from the OBX-A through the Matrix 12. It's a pretty exciting time.
So all those classic Oberheim products have got your fingerprints on them. Did you have a particular role in the design of those?
Yeah, I was, I think, the initial idea was, at the time, when I started, Tom Oberheim and Jim Cooper were the only engineers there, and pretty classic in companies where you have the engineering department understanding all the technology, and you have like a sales and marketing department that thinks they know what the customer wants. And, I guess what Tom saw in me is someone who had a keen technical interest, but was also all the customer. So I kind of ended up being the person in between, and quickly gravitated mainly to doing the design work, but brought to it the sensibility of the actual user, because I was performing a lot and doing a lot of session work and things like that. So I was using the synthesizer. So you could say, initially for me, my role was to have the pleasure of being the selfish designer, because I was really designing synths primarily for myself. So that meant, being able to specify a lot of features that maybe wouldn't have come up otherwise, and working with the team. So I was involved in hardware and software design.
And Dave, right about that time, of course, the Prophet 5 was the synth to have, arguably. Oberheim were one of your major competitors.
We hated each other.
Yeah.
Hated.
Absolutely.
There was always blood on the trade show floors, I'm sure. But your relationship must go back to those days, I guess.
Yes, Marcus likes to say that he met me when I introduced the Prophet 5 in 1978 in the basement of the Disneyland Hotel. That's how big NAMM was at the time. I don't remember that, but you were only...
I was 16. 16.
I was probably like, go away, kid, And
I like everyone else, I was blown away by the Prophet 5. Just thought, this is the future, so.
But, we were always intense competitors, but we were always friends, even back then. We would always hang out at trade shows, go out drinking. It was a small industry, and we were all in it together. But we didn't like each other's products, and that sucks, that's horrible, get this one, don't get that. So it was a very fun time, actually.
But I'm sure that behind all that facade, you actually had a great deal of respect for the Oberheim synths of that time. What was it that you particularly liked about them?
Well, it's actually kind of funny, because I know a whole lot more about the Oberheim products now than I did then.
Yeah.
Because designing the OBX-8, I had to go through everything, start to finish, on the OBX, the OBX-A, and the OB8. And I honestly didn't really know that much about it back then, because it was like, well, there's their thing, there's my thing, and my thing's better, so I don't have to know about that. But clearly the whole thing is the Oberheim has its sound. There's something about that sound that it's unique, and it just cuts through, it kind of grabs you, and that's always been there. So it was really kind of fun to get to know at this time.
Well, I think what's interesting you get to realize back at that time, I think we were just kind of living in our own worlds. I mean, it's like I was just completely immersed in everything Oberheim. You were completely immersed in everything Sequential. And you just knew, it's like, sure, they're a great company making great products, but it's like you weren't paying attention necessarily because it wasn't about like copying each other. Though Tom says very clearly, I mean, the Prophet 5 was a key inspiration and in fact a critical pivotal moment for Oberheim, because the Prophet 5 completely changed their business. The Oberheim 4 voice was king of polyphonic synthesis before the Prophet 5, and sales suddenly stopped. So the OBX was certainly a direct response to the Prophet 5, because just for survival, Oberheim needed a poly synth. But just like Dave was doing things his way, which was what makes Prophets magical, Tom and Jim, they started with an Oberheim 4 voice, and they, that discrete oscillator and the state variable filter, 2-pole filter, distinctly different sound than the 4 poles that were in Moog's and Prophets. So this sonic signature, would carry forward and, made Oberheim just different, not better. It's like having guitar players argue about Les Pauls versus Strats. They're great instruments and they're just different. And
personal preference.
Have both, because you want to be able to do what both do.
And that 5-year period that you were at Oberheim, I mean, that was a period of incredible change and development in the synth industry. Going into it, there were hardly any polysynths on the market at all, and coming out of it, you had things like the Matrix 12, and then you had, of course, the DX7 come and take over. Do you think you kind of reached the limits of what was possible with the analog technology of the day?
Well, I think we're proving that we weren't anywhere near that in the last 20 years of our analog products now. I mean, everything we've built, the Prophet 12, Prophet X, Prophet 6, OB6, Pro 3, all of these products, they're all analog synths, and they go so far beyond what we did back in the early 80s. Back then, everybody was tied up in what's new? Oh, DX7, oh, that's new. Oh, M1, that's new. And there was this other thing, people mostly wanted the best emulative sound. They weren't really interested in synthesizers for a synthesizer. Like the Prophet 5, for the first time, a keyboard player can go from, organ, strings, brass, pads. They didn't know anything about synthesizers. They just wanted to be able to do all of that on stage. And that's pretty much what everybody really wanted. And so when the DX7 came out, we don't have to carry our Rhodes around anymore. And then the M1 came out, and now we finally have what we really wanted, real samples and all that. Right. So that's when we went into what I call the digital dark ages of the 90s, when there was no innovation and no analog. And it wasn't until 2000 that it started coming back and people started going, this just sounds pretty good. It's not as dry. It's got some life to it. And then they started discovering the old instruments. I could buy this old thing for $50 or $100 and it sounds great. And it's just blossomed ever since. It's just,
And did you think at the time that those were the dark ages? Were you always conscious of the difference in sound between analog and digital?
Yeah, and you may know that I was involved with the first soft synths back in the mid-90s. We had something called Reality, which was the first pro soft synth. And I quickly realized that it wasn't any fun to play. Typing, mounting, dragging stuff, then go over here and play a couple notes. And so I stopped doing it, and that's when I started getting interested in hardware again. It was because of that. It's, as a musician, trying to interact and get inspiration from what's supposedly a musical instrument, for me, just didn't work when it was on a screen. So that's when I started working on the Evolver, in the 2000, which is 20 years ago is when that came out.
So it's 20 years now of the reborn analog synths that you've been creating, and that's actually a much longer period than they were ever around for in the first place.
Right.
Exactly, and this time it's for real. It's because people want to play a synthesizer, and it's passed. Basic analog subtractive synthesis has passed the test of time. Everybody knows what to do when you walk up to a synth, and what's going to happen when you turn the cutoff knob or the resonance knob. You just know what's going to happen. It doesn't matter what brand who made it, if it's really old or really new. You just know what to expect. You know, it's been around 50, 60 years now, so I think it'll be around forever.
And do you both think that you're designing better analog synths for the experience of having spent some years away from that and working on digital products and other kinds of instrument? And
we get all the advantages of the advancements in digital, in technology, in tools, in manufacturing. There's, all the advantage of that, while we can still keep, in the case of the OBX8, a 100% pure analog signal path, right? But with much better processors to make sure things are really in tune, if you want them in tune, and can make sure they're out of tune when you want them out of tune. And it's all the stuff that we dreamed of doing, but in the 80s, the Matrix 12 was the most advanced synth we did. We were, squeezing every ounce of power out of these microcontrollers to wrestle the analog stuff to do what we wanted it to do. And now, these capabilities make that so much easier.
So even with those older analog synths, it's actually the digital side that was the limitation on what you could design into them.
Oh, it was both. The analog side was pretty wonky, but now we have the advantage of very high-speed DSP processors to keep, do the housekeeping and making sure, when we were doing the OBX8, we looked at a lot of old OBXs and OB8s, and they were all different. Because if they weren't calibrated the same way, and they weren't, I mean, they were all different. It was hard because, there are 50, 60 trimmers inside that had to be set perfectly. Now we just have a processor just automatically keeps it all in line, and so we can make sure it's as perfect as we want it to be. And like you said, if you don't want it perfect, turn up the vintage knob and it's sounds like the old stuff.
Well, the other thing it's kind of interesting, how things evolve over time. Is like in the case of course, the OB8, the last of the OB series was where we were starting to do some of the modulation in software. So the LFOs and portamento and the pitch and mod levers, those were all being done in software where they'd been analog before. And the limitations of the processor became a specific aspect of how those modulations sounded. And so in doing the OBX8, we realized we have a much more powerful processor, so we can make it have, completely smooth range of speed and depth and so on. But then you can't necessarily recreate exactly what those originals sound like. So we actually had to put some of the limitations back in so that you can hear, and of course you can turn this off, but if you want to get exactly the sound of an OB8, you want to have the LFO speed only be quantized to these specific steps. And to, when you're tracking from the keyboard, you hear these odd discontinuities. But some of the sounds that are endearing that we know and love now are only possible because of those limitations. So, but what's great is now the limitations aren't there because we have no choice. Now we can choose to put them in or not because we've got plenty of processing power to have that operate how we want. It's kind of fun and quirky.
Sure, and I was surprised to hear that. I mean, given that you've both been at the forefront of this business for such a long time, this is actually the first time you've ever collaborated.
This is our actual first product collaboration.
That's right. Yeah.
And how was that? Many arguments?
Oh yeah, maybe a few. Well, as any standard pig-headed designer, we have our own way of doing things, and you have a way of doing things, I have a way, and they don't always cross paths, and a lot of it, interestingly enough, came back to some of the old decisions from back then. Well, we did it this way. That's kind of a dumb way to do it. Yeah, but that's the way it was done, and we didn't like how that worked. And so we were able to just go back to, well, what's the right way to do it for these products? And that's where it was invaluable having Marcus involved. I could not have done this product, without him there to, because I'd say, oh, we could just do this. That's close enough. And he'd go, no, let's do it exact. We're going to do this. I have the source code. This is what we're going to do. And I'd have to roll my eyes and say, oh, okay.
For me, it was the best of both worlds, right? Because, Sequential is the best in the business of doing this now. And it's unquestionable. It's just all these great products. So to be able to take that expertise, this great design team, Dave's experience, obviously, in building this system, But then, yes, they had to put up with me and others saying, yeah, but here's exactly how it worked. And I think it's really paid off in the end. There's great products don't happen easily. That's just the way it works. You have to be willing to go through those pains and trials and tribulations. But in the end, we literally can take the cassette data from the original factory tapes of an OBX, OBXA, or OB8 and load them into this synth, and it sounds exactly like the originals. So I think the effort has paid off.
But at the same time, the OBX8 is more than merely a recreation of those synths.
Well, what's great, actually, I think an early misconception when we first launched this, because we say it's all 3D synths in one, is people imagine like, well, there must be 3 modes. Like, which synth do you want it to be? Instead, it's a complete superset of everything of the 3, and you can mix and match anything you want. So the available sonic palette you have now is everything those individually did, everything they could do in combination, and then add a layer on top of that of all the new capabilities that we put in that wasn't in any of the original 3. So it's truly the best of all of that. Recreate all the original sounds and a huge sonic palette to create new sounds.
And very much a synth player's instrument, I imagine.
Yeah, there's so much that was performance oriented, a lot of it which was a real pain to develop, that these original synths had, that we captured all of it in terms of how you can perform with the knobs, how all the quirky, fun stuff of the OB8 arpeggiator is in there, all of the hidden features are in there, if you were used to working it in that way. But we've made them also more obvious in page 2 in the display for those who might not have been familiar with the original quirks. But it's absolutely a performance synth.
Well, I for one can't wait to get my hands on one. In the meantime, thank you so much, Dave and Marcus. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. In a moment, I hope we're going to get someone who's a better keyboard player than me to demo the OBX. And all that remains for me to do is to thank you very much. Have a great show.
Great, thank you. It's fun.